Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this evening. So appreciate your taking the time. Just going to give it about 30 seconds or so just to give people time to join the presentation, but we will be getting started very soon. All right, seems to be slowing down. We'll give it another 20 seconds or so, and then I will dive in here. All right, looks like everybody's in. So welcome everybody. I'm Drew Heilpern from Summit Educational Group, and so appreciate everyone joining tonight. I hope the information I'm going to present to you is helpful. Before I dive in, just a couple quick logistical things. The first one is I'm going to cover a lot of ground tonight in a relatively short amount of time. We are recording this. We'll try to get the link to the recording out to you tomorrow or on Thursday. So definitely please do not feel like you have to hang on my every word tonight. I'll obviously feel flattered if you do, but you will get the link to the recording. So that way, if you want to go back and rewatch or re-listen to any of this, you'll have the opportunity to do so. Also, definitely feel free to share the link to the recording if you have friends or colleagues who you think might be interested in this topic. Definitely feel free to share the recording with them. Also, if you have any questions, just on your screen, there should be a Q&A box. Just as I'm going through the information tonight, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to type those questions in that Q&A box. Just in the interest of time, I'll hold questions to the end, but I'll keep an eye on the time, keep us moving tonight, and definitely leave time to circle back and answer any questions that you have. But again, thanks so much for joining tonight. I hope this is helpful for you. All right, so with that as a quick intro, let's just dive in here. So again, I'm going to cover a lot of ground tonight in terms of what I am going to cover. Just going to talk about how these tests are used in the school admission process, just to give you a little bit of context for these tests. We'll also do a deeper dive on the scoring of these tests, the format of them, some of the content on them, and some strategy, just so you get a feel in terms of kind of what our students are facing when they take these tests. I'll also talk about options for actually taking them, and then just end this evening by talking about test planning. At a high level, I'll give you some general guidelines, some things to think about as you're thinking about the testing plan for either the SSAT or the ISEE. All right. So, um, as we dive in, just I always like to start here. This is back to that idea that at the end of the day, these really are just tests. They are not the be all end all of the secondary school admission process. There are going to be many, many factors that the schools look at. It is not just going to come down to an SSAT or an ISEE score. So as you can see, there's a number of different factors on the screen. They are ranked. Please keep in mind that different schools are going to put different weights on these different factors, but it does give you kind of a feel in terms of what they're looking for. But I would say most schools that are going to end up on your students list, whether it's an independent day school or even a boarding school, the number one thing they're going to be looking at is your student school performance. Just how are they doing day in and day out in their current school? And I will say the independent school admission process, it does have much more of kind of a personal feel to it as opposed to, or comparing it to, say, like the college admission process, where the admission officers from these schools, they are really going to try to get to know your student and also get to know you as a family as well. So they are going to put a considerable amount of time and weight into reading those teacher recommendations, just trying to get a sense in terms of how your student is going to fit in at the particular school. What else are they going to bring to the school community, even outside of their day in and day out academics? So, how do they interact with other students? What does their interaction look like with their current teachers? Again, they are trying to just get a little bit more of a bigger picture in terms of what your student is actually like. I have test scores here as number three. take this with a little bit of grain of salt. There's definitely schools out there where they're going to put little to almost no weight on those test scores. And then there are some schools out there where they might lean into the testing a little bit more. So again, I have it third here on the list. But again, just keep that in mind that this is a little bit subjective on my part. Different schools are going to put different values on those testing scores. And again, back to that point of they're really trying to get to know your student, as a person. They're very interested in terms of extracurricular activities that your student's involved in. What else are they going to bring to the campus outside of just day-to-day classroom work that they're going to do? So for instance, are they interested in sports? Are they interested in music? Are they interested in art? Are they interested in theater? Because at the independent school, they are building a larger community. There are often many, many different extracurricular activities that are available to students. So they are very interested in learning what their outside interests, kind of outside of day-to-day school, looks like for them. Again, back to that idea that they are going to try to get to know the student a little bit more personally. Almost all schools require a personal interview. Again, they're just trying to get a sense of students' personality a little bit, get a sense of, kind of what motivates that student, kind of who that student is as a person. They absolutely are going to be reading the application essays. Again, it just gives them a little bit more insight into the student's personality, kind of how they're approaching the independent school process, kind of what's motivating them, what they're hoping to get out of that independent school if they're offered admission to that particular school. Also, depending on the schools that end up on your list, just for the parents and guardians, just be warned, there are essays that you actually might need to write as well and fill out as part of this application process. Again, not just getting to know the student, but they're also interested in learning more about the family as well. And then demonstrated interest. If you're not familiar with this term, what this means is just if a school offers a spot of admission to your student, just what is the likelihood that they're actually going to accept that spot? So as the name implies, throughout this process, what they're looking at is just how interested do they think you actually are in attending that school. So this can be demonstrated through, attending open houses, staying in contact with the admission folk, not in an overbearing way, but just if they have events, trying to go to those events. You're just trying to avoid giving off that feel of like, oh, at the very last minute, like you just added this school to your list, and you might not actually have any interest in going to that school, but for whatever reason, you're just like, you know what? Let's just add this to our current school list. So that's the idea of demonstrated interests. And as you can see, there are many, many factors that are going to go into that final secondary school admission decision. It's not just going to come down to like an SSAT or an ISEE score. Okay, so when we're talking about the testing landscape itself, it's important to keep in mind that it is a very competitive sort of cohort group that your students are up against when they take these tests. So it's a very, in some ways, small population of students that are taking these tests because, again, it's only students who are interested in applying out to independent schools. So this is just recent numbers from test takers for the SSAT, just to give us a little bit of context on this. So, for eighth graders who are applying out to ninth grade is the upper level SSAT that they are taking, but they had 64,530 students take that test. For the upper level SSAT, there's also some ninth graders who are applying out to 10th grade who took it, or even some ninth graders who are looking to repeat ninth grade and are applying back out to ninth grade. You can see the number there, 12,503 students. There are some 10th graders who will take the SSAT again, either applying out for 10th to repeat 10th grade or even to 11th grade. And then you can see a small number of 11th graders actually take the SSAT. And to put these numbers in perspective for you, if we look on the college side, the two major tests that students are taking for college admissions are the SAT and the ACT. But to give you a feel in terms of just kind of how small and competitive this population is, on the SAT side, it's roughly about 1.6 million students who are going to take an SAT and about 1 to 1.1 million students who are taking an ACT. So when we compare that sort of 64,000 eighth graders to that, kind of 1.6 million number of SAT takers, again, it gives you the sense in terms of just kind of how small this cohort group is and how competitive it is. And even though for our upper level SSAT, we have eighth graders, ninth graders, 10th graders, and even some 11th graders taking the same test. Eighth graders are only compared to other eighth graders, ninth graders compared to other ninth graders, 10th graders compared to other 10th graders, and then 11th graders compared to 11th graders. Because obviously, comparing an eighth grader's performance on this test to a 10th grader's performance on the test would be completely unfair. So students are normed against students who are in the same grade that are taking that test. But again, it does give you a sense in terms of just the competitive population that are taking these tests. So what that means is really the main objective of both these tests, of both the SSAT and the ISEE, is to distribute this again, this competitive population through this or around this bell curve. So what this means, practically speaking, so we're looking at the bell curve for the SSAT students. I think this is the bell curve for actually eighth graders who have taken the test. Is there are many, many bright students who are going to end up, and high achieving students who are going to end up in kind of the middle of this bell curve. So kind of in the, 40th, 50th, 60th percentile. And again, that's just kind of the nature of the test. It's the nature of the smaller population who is taking this test. It's a reflection of the competitive nature of this test that many, many, many bright students kind of do end up trapped in the middle of that bell curve. And the secondary school admission folk, when they're looking at standardized testing scores, they absolutely understand this. So they are looking at those percentile scores in kind of that context. So I just share this with you is sometimes for students, it can be a little bit jarring, especially if they've done more national standardized tests, like an ERB, for instance. And on those types of tests, because it's a national test and they're up against a much larger cohort group, oftentimes students are very used to being in that kind of, 80th, 90th, even 95th plus percentile on a test like that. And then suddenly they're taking the SSAT and they find themselves kind of in the middle of that bell curve. And again, it can be a little bit jarring for them to be like, oh my gosh, I'm in like the 50th or 60th percentile on this. But again, it's not reflective of any kind of deficiencies in their education or any, major holes or gaps or skills that they are lacking. It's because of the nature of the test and the distribution of these very bright kids in that small competitive group into this bell curve. So just wanted to provide up front a little bit of context for those percentile scores on these tests. Okay, so we'll start by talking about the SSAT. So the two major admission tests that you're looking at are generally the SSAT and the ISEE. As you're putting your school list together, it is worth noting which kind of test that school might be looking for. So I'm based out of our Waltham, Massachusetts office. So here for our independent day schools in kind of the Boston area, generally speaking, if you're applying out for high school, so if you're applying out for 9th, 10th, 11th, or 12th grade, generally the test that they are going to be looking for is the SSAT. For our independent schools that start in, fifth grade, sixth grade, seventh grade, those earlier grades. Generally, again, for our independent schools here in the Boston area, it's mostly the ISEE that they are going to be looking for. So just to put it on your radar, though, just to try to get a sense early on in this process for the schools that might end up on your list, which test are they looking for? Are they looking for the SSAT? Are they looking for the ISEE? Some schools will accept both. They don't have a preference for one test over the other, but there are kind of two major tests when we're looking at the independent school landscape. So I'm going to start by talking about the SSAT. I'll walk you through that one, and then I'll switch gears and we'll review the ISEE just so you're familiar with that test as well. But one of the major just philosophies behind the SSAT, and this is true of the ISEE as well, is the SSAT, it still is very much an aptitude test. So when we talk about aptitude in its purest form, we think about that as being like an IQ type of test, measuring a student's kind of innate ability to learn. It is not an achievement test. So it is by design very, very different from kind of the type of questions that students are going to see sort of day in and day out in school. And just to give you a feel for this, like one of the hallmarks of an aptitude test is vocabulary, and vocabulary is kind of front and central on some of the ELA stuff that students will see on the SSAT. So for students who take an SSAT for the first time, ideally their first exposure to it would be in a practice setting. Definitely reach out to us to have your student take a practice SSAT just so they get sort of familiar with the test and the type of questions that they're going to see on it. But oftentimes students who walk out of an SSAT for the first time, usually their reaction is something like, Drew, like, what on earth? Like, what the heck was that? Like, I've never seen questions like that on anything I've done day in and day out in school. And that's all by design. So they are trying to expose students to questions that they've never seen before and try to measure their critical thinking ability, their problem solving skills, just how do they react to those types of questions that, again, are very outside of what they're seeing day in and day out in school. But the irony of having an aptitude test is what that means is it is very coachable. And the reason for that is if they're trying to measure, like, hey, here's questions you've never seen before, we're trying to gauge how well you do with those types of questions. If students have seen the questions before or those types of questions and have some strategy around them and have had some practice with them, they're obviously going to have an easier time with those questions. So when we talk about test prep, I'll get into this a little bit. In addition to teaching them strategy, it's also about just getting them more comfortable with the type of questions that they're going to see so they can show off a little bit, kind of put their best foot forward on it and kind of have a game plan for it and know what to expect when they're going into these tests. And just to give you a feel for this, again, a little bit of context on this. So the SAT and the ACT, especially the SAT, it used to be much more of an aptitude test. It kind of moved away from that sort of in the early 2000s. The SAT, even the ACT for that matter, are now much more achievement tests. They're much more curriculum based. They are much more aligned with kind of what students are learning day in and day out in school. But the SSAT, even the ISEE for that matter, very disconnected from that, very much hanging on to its aptitude roots. Okay, so when we talk about the SSAT, kind of the two major levels that our students are preparing for are either the middle level, again, if they're applying out into middle school, or the upper level, if they are applying out into high school. And here's the format of the test. So it's going to start with a writing sample. That I'll do a deeper dive in terms of what the writing sample is and kind of what they're looking for, but the writing sample is not scored. So it is not factored into kind of their overall performance on this test in terms of their scoring of it or their percentile rank on these tests. Um, Admission officers can see the writing sample, so they do have access to it if they want to just get a sense in terms of kind of how a student does on their writing in a more time setting, kind of what are they able to produce in that sort of limited amount of time. Then there's two quantitative sections or two math sections. There's a reading section. There's a verbal section. Again, a hallmark of the aptitude of an aptitude test. This verbal section is very vocabulary heavy. On the SSAT, there's synonyms and there's analogies, and I'll walk you through some sample questions just so you get a feel for what those questions look like. There's also an experimental section at the end. This experimental section, it doesn't actually count. What they're doing in that last section is they're just trying to test out questions that they might that might appear on future tests. And as you can see, for both the middle level and the upper level, they're long, right? It's 3 hours and 5 minutes. So that's certainly part of the preparation and the test taking experience for students. Can they actually just hang in there? Can they actually stay focused and work their way through a 3 hour and 5 minute test? So in terms of the level of tests, it's all about the grade that you're applying into. So again, you do want to check in with the school to see if they have a preference for the SSAT or the ISEE. But for students who are applying out into grades 4 and 5, it's going to be just the shorter elementary level tests. For students who are applying out for 6th grade, 7th grade, or 8th grade, it's going to be the middle level test. And again, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders all take the same test, but 6th graders are only compared to 6th graders, 7th graders to 7th graders, 8th graders to 8th graders. Otherwise, it'd be completely unfair. And then for the students who are applying out to high school, whether they're applying out to 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, or 12th grade, it's going to be the upper level test that they will take. And again, 8th graders compared to 8th graders, 9th graders compared to 9th graders, 10th to a 10th graders, and 11th graders to 11th graders. So at the 30,000 foot view, that's kind of the format of that SSAT. In terms of the scoring of it, every question on the SSAT is worth 1 point. So the easiest math questions and the hardest math questions, they're all worth the same. It's all worth 1 point. Similarly, the easiest verbal question and the hardest analogy, also the same, also only worth 1 point. So there is no weighted scoring for these questions. They're all worth the same, regardless of level of difficulty. And then the SSAT, it also has what we call, this is kind of, again, back old school to like that SAT, if you remember that, but it has what's called the guessing penalty. So the way this raw score is calculated is they're going to add up every single question that a student got right, in, for instance, the reading. And any question that a student skips, it's just going to be +0. So +1 for every question they've answered correctly, +0 for any question that they've skipped. And then there is a 1/4 point deduction. We call it the guessing penalty for every question that they get wrong. So because of this guessing penalty, really at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is we're trying to maximize the number of questions that students answer correctly and minimize the questions that they miss. But because of this guessing penalty, there is some strategy involved in terms of whether students should guess or not. And here's the strategy in terms of the guessing. So there's 5 answer choices on the SSAT. Anytime a student can eliminate one answer choice, if they have a good reason, they know that that answer choice is incorrect, so they get it down to 4 answer choices, the odds are actually slightly in their favor that they should guess at that point. Sometimes I'll get students who are like, Drew, I've only eliminated one answer choice. Like, I'm really not comfortable guessing at this point. And I'm totally fine with that if they want to just skip it. But if students can eliminate 2 answer choices, so they get it down to 3 answer choices, they absolutely have to guess. They are hurting their score if they don't guess. And then when they're 50-50 on it, which sometimes for students can be the hardest one, they're like, Drew, I got it down to 50-50. Like, I really don't want to guess at this point. Like, I'll skip it. Maybe I'll come back to it. But they absolutely have to guess if they get it down to 50-50, because again, they're hurting their score if they don't. So some of the strategy for the SSAT is students understanding when they should skip a question and when they should guess. Because if they, if they can eliminate answer choices and they don't end up guessing, they just leave it blank, they're actually hurting their score. So that's how the raw score is calculated. Then the raw score is going to be converted into scaled scores, and then the scaled scores are converted into percentile scores. And most schools, when they look at an SSAT score, what they're looking at is that percentile rank. Just how well did, for instance, your eighth grader do on that upper level SSAT compared to other eighth graders who also took in upper level SSAT. So here's the score report just to orient us, just to give you a feel in terms of what the score report looks like. So it's, as you can see, it's divided up into three different sections, right? We have our verbal section, we have our math section, and we have our reading section. So on the verbal, it's 60 items. So it's 30 synonyms and then 30 analogies. On the math, there's two math sections, each 25 questions each. So it's out of a total of 50 questions. And then on the reading, there's reading passages and then 40 reading questions. So again, just to give you a feel on the scoring of it, we can just look at the verbal one here. So this student answered, of the 60 questions, they answered 26 correctly. So 1 point for each question they answered correctly. So that's plus 26. Then they missed 12 questions. So they're going to lose a quarter point for every question that they missed. So that's 12 times 0.25 or times a quarter. That's going to reduce their raw score by 3 points, and then plus 0 for any question that they skip. So this particular student skipped 22 of the questions. So their raw score ended up being 23 out of 60. And then again, comparing their performance, so that 23 out of 60 is then converted into a scaled score. So that is 656 out of a 500 to 800 point scale. And that 656 ended up being the 45th percentile. Again, just a little bit of a deeper dive on the score report, just so you get a sense in terms of how the scoring on this actually works. So if I were advising this student, skipping 22 questions, it's not actually that horrible. And again, 45th percentile is a pretty solid score on that verbal section. But I might encourage the student to try to maybe be a little bit more aggressive, see on some of these questions that they've skipped, if they could actually eliminate some answer choices to, if nothing else, put them in a better position to guess. So they'll see schools, again, we'll look at mostly the percentile scores. They'll see the scaled scores as well. But 45th percentile on the verbal, 55th percentile on the quantitative, 32nd percentile on the reading. You can see the raw scores and how many they missed there to get a sense in terms of what their raw score was to get into that 32nd percentile. And then on the score report, there'll also be an overall score. So what they're going to do for the overall score is they're just going to add the scale scores of the verbal, the quantitative, and the reading. And then that scaled score for the overall score is going to be converted into an overall percentile score. Okay, so that's the way the scoring works on the SSAT. And, especially for our eighth graders who are taking the upper level SSAT, again, with eighth graders, ninth graders, 10th graders, even some 11th graders all taking the same test. Especially for our eighth graders, they do get thrown under the bus a little bit because there are questions on this test that are really not geared towards eighth graders. They're trying to make the test challenging for ninth and 10th graders. So with those types of questions, again, our eighth graders get a little bit thrown under the bus there. But it is important for students to understand that there are questions on there that are going to be challenging, that they're really not expected to answer, that they actually don't need to answer in order to do well on this test. Because our eighth graders, the scale is going to be pretty forgiving for them. And what I mean by that is let's just look at the raw score and the scale score and the percentile score from the verbal section. And each test, obviously, this scoring scale is going to change a little bit from test to test depending on level of difficulty and things, but it does give you a feel for this. So, let's say, for instance, a student, felt pretty good about 20 of the 30 synonyms and felt pretty good about 20 out of 30 of the analogies and actually answered all of those questions that they attempted correctly. So they ended up with a raw score of 40 out of 60. Now we're thinking to ourselves, all right, Drew, so 40 out of 60, right? That's two-thirds, that's 67%. Like that's a D plus. But if we look at the conversion scale on that verbal, that 40 out of 60 ends up putting that student probably somewhere in like the 85th to 87th percentile there, which is a really, strong, rock solid score on that verbal. So it is important for students to realize that they do not need to answer every single question correctly in order to be able to do well on this test. Because sometimes students, if they're not familiar with the scoring scale, they can get a little bit frustrated. For instance, on the math, like let's say a student's able to answer, 15 of the 25 questions correctly, and the last 10 questions, they're just like, Drew, like I had no idea. I just skipped them. And they did that for both sections of the math. Again, that's going to give them a raw score of about 30 out of 50, right? That could be like solid, like mid 70th percentile on that. So just going into these, into the SSAT, it's important that they understand the guessing penalty. It's important that they understand when they should guess and when they should skip. And it's also very important that they not get frustrated by some of the harder questions on this test. They don't actually need to answer those correctly in order to do well on this test. And then the other point that I try to make to students and families around the SSAT scoring, because, of the distribution of scores in that bell curve, depending on what a student's ultimate goal score might be in terms of their percentile, coming out of a practice test, even though the score might seem a little bit low to them, they might not be as far away from their goal as it might initially seem. So for instance, back to the verbal section here. So if a student's able to increase their raw score on the verbal, so +6, if they're able to go from 28 out of 60 to 34 out of 60, so if they can find like three more synonyms and three more analogies that they can answer correctly, you can see kind of the dramatic effect that it has on their overall percentile score. So this student's going to jump from just answering three more analogies correctly and three more synonyms correctly from that 61st percentile, again, which is a very solid starting score, to that 77th percentile. So especially coming out of a practice test, I just don't want students to get discouraged, by their initial score and their initial percentile scores, because oftentimes, again, depending on what their ultimate goal score is, it might just be, anywhere from like 5 to 10 questions that we need to swing in their favor to have a pretty dramatic impact in terms of their overall percentile score. All right, so we're just going to do a quick deeper dive on the different sections of the SSAT just to give you a feel in terms of kind of what it looks like. So on the math, again, already talked about this, but for both the middle level and upper level, there's two math sections. There's 25 questions and there's 30 minutes. They have 30 minutes for each of those sections. And the SSAT, it's not really testing advanced math skills. It's most of the difficulty is trying to figure out like kind of what the question is asking and figuring out an approach to solve it and being able to handle word problems and also being able to handle kind of multi-step problems. Again, there is going to be some advanced math, but for our eighth graders who are taking it, who are applying out to ninth grade, again, they don't need those questions. Those more advanced math questions are on the test again to make it challenging for kind of our 10th and 11th graders who might be taking this test. So here's an example of kind of again sort of leaning into the aptitude component of this test. A word problem that on its surface seems pretty complicated, like John is X years old and Paul is 8 years older than John. If in 4 years Paul will be twice as old as John, then how old is John now? And what makes this question challenging is when the SSAT writes a question like this, what they're really expecting students to do is to solve it in what I call the forward way, like to come up with some kind of algebraic equation here and to solve it. But students don't actually need to approach it that way. So one of the strategies that can be very helpful for solving SSAT math questions is it's a multiple choice test. So the answer is right there in front of them. So just getting students comfortable with plugging in, like working the question backwards, starting with the answers, plugging those answers into the question, and seeing if they can find the answer that way. So again, as I mentioned in the beginning, because it's an aptitude test, the SSAT, it is very susceptible to coaching. If students go in with some strategy and a game plan, it's definitely going to help them in terms of kind of hitting their full potential on this test. So plugging in, working a math problem backwards is definitely an important strategy that students need to be able to implement on the SSAT, also helpful on the ISEE as well. The other useful strategy, if students know how to do this is what we call choosing numbers. So the other game that the SSAT is going to play is they're going to take a pretty straightforward question and they're going to try to make it more confusing and more abstract by taking out the numbers and putting variables in its place. So in this particular example, if they had worded this question as Nate bought a burger for $2 and a drink for $1. He paid with the $10 bill. What was the amount of change in dollars he received? If they had a question like that, most students would read that question and be like, true, like that's the easiest question. Like, what on earth is that doing on the SSAT? But what makes it challenging and more difficult is they're going to take those numbers out and put variables in its place, B and D. But if students know this strategy of choosing numbers, they're going to make B $2, for instance, D $1, for instance, and then solve the question using those numbers. It's just taking a very kind of confusing abstract problem, making it much more concrete, making it much more easily solved. And then all students do is they essentially take those numbers that I chose, plug them into the answer choices, and find that answer that actually works with the number that they chose. Again, it takes a little bit of practice, but once students get comfortable with this strategy, it can be very, very helpful in answering some of the math questions they're going to see on this test. There are challenging math problems. I've already mentioned this. For instance, this is, some quadratic notation here. This probably going to be question 25 out of 25 because on the math, the questions do go in order from easier to harder. And again, our eighth graders absolutely do not need to spend any time on this. They are not expected to answer this. They do not need to answer this in order to do well on it. Obviously, if they've been exposed to some quadratic notation and can solve this question, absolutely they can. But again, the easiest question and the hardest questions are all worth plus 1 point. So I'd rather have students spend their time on the questions they know how to do and not spend 10 minutes, kind of getting frustrated and banging their head against the desk going after something like this. They'd be much better off just skipping this. But there are challenging math questions on this, again, geared towards our 9th, 10th, and 11th graders, or even our 10th or 11th graders, trying to make the test challenging for them. Here's another example of a challenging math problem. This is probability and probability notation. Most eighth graders probably haven't been exposed to this. Obviously, if they have been and can answer it, that's great. But again, I don't want students wasting all their time getting frustrated attempting a math question like this. Reading comprehension, students are going to be given passages, and then there's questions pertaining back to that passage. 40 questions, 40 minutes. So again, just students are going to be pressed for time a little bit on the reading. There is certainly a stamina component to taking these tests. And on the reading, where the misdirection or the aptitude component comes from for the reading section of the SSAT is Really, what they're going to try to do is based on the questions that they're asking students, and more importantly, like the answer choices that they are being presented with. What they're going to try to do is they're going to try to misdirect the student and try to get the student to think that the passage was about something completely different than what it was actually about. So, in terms of one of the useful strategies for the reading, is we encourage students to highlight, to underline the passage, to focus on main ideas, and to actually map it. Like, what was the main point of the beginning of the passage, the middle of the passage, and the end of the passage? And then we also work with students on summarizing the passage. So when they're done reading it and reading it actively, just in a couple sentences, what was that passage about? Because it is a reading comprehension assignment. So at the end of the day, they're trying to show that they read and understood the passage. Choose that answer choice that reflects their understanding of that passage. Again, hallmark of an aptitude test on the verbal section, there's going to be 30 synonyms, there's going to be 30 analogies. Here's the synonyms. Again, SAT, as it moved to a more curriculum-based test, it got rid of analogies or synonyms and analogies back in, I think, like 1998. But here we are in the year 2026 and still appearing on the SSAT. So again, where the SSAT is tricky is they're going to try to misdirect students a little bit. So here's a word, exhaustive. So what they're going to try to do is, students might look at exhaustive and be like, Drew, I have no idea what exhaustive means, but I know what exhaust is, or I know what exhausted is, and that's tired. So that's why answer choice A is there. Again, trying to misdirect students, trying to get them to choose answer choice A. Also, they might not know what exhaustive is, but they know exhaust, and they're like, oh, okay, well, that's what, comes out of the tailpipe of my mom's car. So that's why polluted is there. So one of the strategies on the synonyms is we try to get students to put it in a sentence or put it in a word or phrase just to give them a little bit more context for it. Also, to cover up the answers, to try to come up with their own answer first before they start looking at the answer choices. Because if you look at tired, it's really hard to move away from tired once you've seen it. Obviously, I don't want students just, sitting there for 5 minutes with their hand over the answer choices. At some point, I want them to uncover the answer choices and actually look. But again, just trying to get students to be a little bit more proactive in their testing and a little less reactive in their testing. There's challenging synonyms. Again, what makes the challenging synonyms hard is just the vocabulary that students are going to be exposed to. Again, there's going to be 30 synonyms, generally going in, relative order of easier to harder. And again, our eighth graders who are taking the upper level SSAT, they don't need to answer those hardest synonyms correctly to do well, as we saw when we looked at the scoring table for that verbal section. They can just skip some of those words that they really have never seen before. On the analogies, again, very, very coachable. The trick to the analogies is what we call forming a clear, concise relationship between the stem words. So, when we work with students, when they get to the analogy section, what they need to be able to do is to be able to, for instance, an example like this, come up with, well, the trunk is the part of the automobile where you store stuff. And then once you have that clear, concise relationship between the STEM words, you just apply that same relationship to all the answer choices. And I always joke with students, when you stop speaking English or what you say makes no sense, it's because it is not the answer. So limb is the part of the tree where you store stuff. That doesn't really make sense. Closet's the part of the bedroom where you store stuff. Like, yeah, that makes sense. It could be that. Page is part of the manual where you store stuff. No. Grass is part of the lawn where you store stuff. No. Toe is part of the body where you store stuff. That's kind of a disgusting image. No. So I know that answer choice is B. And again, this is what I mean when I say the SSAT. Being an aptitude test, very, very coachable. There are some strategies that students can learn pretty readily and apply to this test, which is just going to make it much, much easier for them. On the analogies, there's challenging analogies. What makes an analogy challenging is the vocabulary that's potentially going to show up in the STEM words and in the answer choices. And also sometimes just the relationship between the STEM words isn't always clear. Okay, already mentioned this, that the first part of the test, it starts with the writing sample. It is not scored, so it's not factored into the scaled score or raw score or percentile rankings, but admission officers can see the writing sample if they are interested in that. And for both the middle level and the upper level, they're really trying to choose prompts that they think a typical student is going to have something to say. So on the middle level, there's a creative prompt or a personal prompt. Students can choose either one. It does not matter, whichever one they are more comfortable writing an essay about. And when we work with students on the writing, it's giving them timed practice so they're used to writing essays under time constraints. And then also just, I want students to have fun with this. I want students, their personality to come through, but I do just want to, I do want students to be aware of who their audience is, that they are writing for admission officers. Obviously, I don't want them to lie. And again, I want their personality and sense of humor to come through, but just keep in mind who their audience is. And then also, that they are looking for an essay. So on the creative prompt, they're looking for a beginning, a middle, or an end. On the creative, this is like the first line to a story, and then they're asked to kind of write the story. So they're looking for a beginning, a middle, and an end to that story. On the personal prompt, again, it is an essay. So they're looking for an intro paragraph, some body paragraphs, and a conclusion. So even when students look at this and I'm like, Drew, I can write this in 3 sentences, like that is not what they are looking for. So this is what the prompts are on the middle level. This is what it looks like on the upper level. Again, that personal prompt, like who is someone you respect and why. And then there's more of a general prompt. This is sometimes, a little bit more of a philosophical question, like do challenges in life define or strengthen us, or do challenges prevent us from realizing our full potential? Again, they're giving students two options just because they want to make sure that the student, can easily, or not easily, but can, read the prompt and be able to write an essay around that prompt. But that's what the prompts on the SSAT look like. Okay. Other test is the ISEE. Again, depending on the grade level and the schools you're applying to, it is worthwhile just to see if they're looking for the SSAT or the ISEE. But similar to what we talked about on the SSAT, ISEE also an aptitude test, measuring a student's quote capability for learning. Again, trying to be disconnected from what they're doing day in and day out in school. Similar to what we talked about on the SSAT, being an aptitude test, ISEE also very coachable. Three different levels for the ISEE. Again, same thing. It depends on the grade that your student's applying into. So students who are applying into fifth and sixth grade, you're looking at that lower level ISEE. Students who are applying out to seventh and eighth grade, so currently in or will be in the fall in sixth or seventh grade, will take the middle level ISEE, and then students applying out to high school, same thing we saw with that upper level SSAT. Students applying out to ninth, 10th, 11th, or even 12th graders are going to be taking that upper level ISEE. And same thing as we saw with the SSAT. Sixth graders are only compared to sixth graders. Seventh graders are only compared to seventh graders because they are taking the same test. They are taking that same middle level test. And then same thing on the upper level, right? Eighth graders, ninth graders, 10th graders, even some 11th graders are all taking the same test, but eighth graders only compared to eighth graders, ninth to ninth, 10th to 10th. Otherwise, it would be completely unfair. In terms of the structure of the ISEE, there's a verbal reasoning section. No analogies on the ISEE. There are synonyms, and then there are sentence completions as the second part of the vocabulary on the ISEE. Quantitative reasoning, that's a math section. Math achievement, another math section. Again, reading comprehension, and then again, same thing. There is an essay this time, it's at the end. Also unscored, but admission officers can see that ISEE essay if they would like to see that writing sample. Okay, ISEE, similar to the scoring that we saw on the SSAT. Every question is worth 1 point. There is no weighted scoring. But one key difference between the ISEE and the SSAT is on the ISEE, there's only 4 answer choices instead of 5. So if students can eliminate 2 answer choices, they're immediately 50-50 on it. And there is no penalty for wrong answers on the ISEE. So students should absolutely guess on the ISEE and not leave anything blank. Whereas on the SSAT, if students really have no idea, I'd much rather they not waste their time trying to kind of fight their way through that question. I'd rather just have them skip it. Whereas on the ISEE, if they have no idea, they have to make sure that they put an answer down because there's no penalty for wrong answers there. Same thing we saw before. Total number of correct answers is that raw score. That raw score is then translated into scaled scores. Those scaled scores are then translated into percentile scores. And then the ISEE goes one step further where they take the percentile scores and they convert them into Stanine scores. And you can see the percentile rank to Stanine score conversion here. And then same thing as we talked about on the SSAT is true of the ISEE. Here's our bell curve. And again, many bright students are going to get trapped in kind of that middle of that bell curve in that 4, 5, or 6 Stanines. Same thing as we talked about before with the SSAT. Again, the admission officers know this, right? Again, which is why they're not which is why an SSAT or an ISEE score is not going to be the be all end all of that student's application. But it gives you a sense, again, in terms of the distribution of those Stanine scores through in this various bell curve. And this is what the score report looks like for the ISEE. I know this is a little bit small, so we'll blow this up here. Again, every question that students answer correctly is +1. That raw score is then converted to a scaled score. It's on a 760 to 940 scale. That scaled score is then converted into a percentile score and then converted into a Stanine score, which most schools are actually looking at that Stanine score. But again, just, with any standardized test, there is always a standard error of measurement associated with the tests. And I give the ISEE some credit here, is they're very upfront in terms of kind of acknowledging that that Stanine score, it does represent a range. And for the ISEE, that range is generally ±1 Stanine. And you can see that here. So for the verbal section, this particular student got a 6 on their verbal. But on any given day, right, that 6 Stanine, it could have been a 5, it could have been a 7. Same thing on the math. That math Stanine was a 5. On any given day, it could have been a 4, it could have been a 6. And again, just to give you a feel in terms of like back to that bell curve, right? So a Stanine of 5, it could be a Stanine of 4. It could also be a Stanine of 6. Right. And we look at the percentages that are covered by that 4, 5, and 6 percentile. You can see it ranges from the 23rd percentile to the 76th percentile. Right. And again, I give the ISE credit for this. They're very upfront about that. But this is what I mean when I say very bright students, because of the nature of the test and the distribution of those scores, they do kind of get trapped in that middle of that bell curve because, again, it's representing from the 23rd percentile to the 76th percentile in that middle of the bell curve. And again, admission folks totally get this and totally understand the limitations of the scoring of that ISEE. All right, verbal reasoning, very similar to what we saw in the SSAT. In terms of the timing, it's 40 questions and 20 minutes. Lower levels a little bit shorter, are fewer questions, but same amount of time there. And we saw this on the SSAT. They're going to get synonyms. They're also going to get sentence completions. So no analogies on the ISEE. So sentence completions are kind of nice just because students are given a little bit more context, a little bit more information in terms of solving this question. Similarly on the math, again, being more of an aptitude test. The quantitative reasoning, it's going to be 37 questions, 35 minutes. Generally, it's going to be word problems. And then for the middle level and upper level, it's going to be also quantitative comparison. So here's an example of a word problem. This is just a probability type of question. And then quantitative comparisons, again, being an aptitude test, SAT used to have quantitative comparisons. It got rid of quantitative comparisons, I think, in 1998. But here it is on the ISEE, still talking about quantitative comparisons. And the quantitative comparisons, it's actually not that bad. Students initially, when they do like a practice test and get to the quantitative comparisons, they absolutely hate this part of the test because they really have no idea what they're doing. But then when they learn some strategy, and they know how to think about it and how to approach it. Oftentimes, the quantitative comparison actually becomes their favorite part of the ISEE because they know how to handle it, they know how to tackle it. So here's the shortcut for it: is quantitative comparisons. If the value of column A is always bigger, the answer is A. If the value in B is always bigger, it's B. If they're always the same, it's C. And then if it cannot be determined, or a better way of thinking about this is if there's more than one answer, the answer choice is D. So to give you an example here, X is greater than 5. Most students are going to be like, oh, well, X is 6, Y is greater 100. That's 101. 101 is greater than 6, so the answer choice is B. But that's not actually what it's saying. So X is greater than 5. Well, X could be 1,000, and Y is greater than 100, so Y could be 110. And now 1,000 is greater than 110. So now the answer choice is A. So there's more than one answer choice here. So that's why that answer choice is D. And again, very susceptible to coaching. When students kind of know how these quantitative comparisons work, they have a much, much easier time with it. Mathematics achievement, that's a little bit more straightforward, a little bit more in line with kind of questions they'll see along in school. But again, it is testing students' critical thinking, their problem-solving skills. So, they might see a question like this where it's like, what's the shaded region of, or what's the area of the shaded region? So students will look at this and be like, Joe, I have no idea. Like, how on earth do I find the shaded region of that? But really, what the way to solve this is, oh, well, if I find the area of the square, which I know how to do, and I remember how to find the area of a triangle, if I subtract the area of the triangle from the entire area of the square, I'm going to be left with the shaded region. And that's what I mean in terms of like a little bit more critical thinking, problem solving ability. How well do students kind of react to questions that they might not typically see? Reading comprehension. Very, very similar to what we saw on the SSAT. Students are given passages and then they're asked to answer questions around those passages. Same idea. We want students to highlight, read actively, map the passage, summarize it, choose that answer choice that shows that they read and understood that passage. Essay, same thing. It's not scored, similar to what we saw on the SSAT. Again, they're trying to give students prompts that they'll have something to write about. Same advice that we give on the SSAT, same as the ISEE. They are looking for an essay. They are looking for a couple paragraphs. And also just keep in mind who your audience is. Again, upper level, describe an experience that has inspired you, or what accomplishment are you most proud of. Again, they're trying to choose prompts where they think students are gonna have be able to write something pretty readily on there. Okay, in terms of when the tests are offered, so if you end up going down the SSAT pass, there are national testing dates that you can register for. So you will create an account essentially through, if you just Google this, like EMA SSAT, you can create essentially your SSAT account, and then you can start it. Registration hasn't opened yet, but when it does, you'll be able to see test centers. It's usually schools that offer the test on these dates. So students can do a paper SSAT. We generally advise students to do the paper SSAT. I just feel like students have an easier time when they have the test booklet in front of them. Here's when all the dates are offered. Generally for the SSAT, students are going to take the test twice, maybe a third time if needed. You can also do an online test through a Prometric center. It's up to 2 computer-based tests, and if you really get in a bind, you can do SSAT at home with a virtual proctor. This is something that they started during COVID. Still working on the technology of that. It's not a great test taking experience. So we generally dissuade students from kind of going down that path. But even though, as you can see, students can take the test multiple times, most students are going to take the SSAT twice, maybe a third time if needed. So usually you're targeting kind of the November test date, that December test date, and then early January if you need that third and final attempt on the SSAT. Also, for both the ISEE and the SSAT, it is also offered as what's called a flex test. Flex just stands for flexible scheduling. So there are independent educational consultants who will offer the SSAT as a flex test. And that just gives you a little bit more freedom in terms of when your student might take that test, because you would schedule it through that independent educational consultant. You're not locked into these national testing dates. The other advantage of the flex test, it does cost more, but it can often also be a smaller test taking environment for students if they do it as a flex test. Schools don't care. They don't care if you do it as a national testing date, as a Prometric test center, or as a flex test. It's all essentially the same SSAT. And just note, if you take the flex test, you can only take the flex test once because there is only one form that is designated as a flex test. If you go down if you end up taking the ISEE, this is true for the lower level, middle level, or upper level. You're limited. You need to take the test in what they call testing windows. And you can take the test once in the fall window and then essentially once in the winter window. So if you go down the ISEE path, we generally recommend take it in November or end of November, just to give students a little bit more time in school. And then you're going to be targeting kind of December or early January for that second attempt. So on the ISEE, students can only take it twice because generally admission deadlines are kind of mid-January or early February. So that spring summer window is not really going to be applicable for the ISEE testing. So we always recommend that students kind of think about these tests with kind of a sane and sensible approach. Do recommend that you try a diagnostic. So we offer free practice SSAT tests and ISEE tests. It's a great way for students to, get some exposure to these tests, get a little bit more comfortable in terms of what the type of questions. You'll also get a score on it. So you'll get a baseline score, but it's really more exposing students to the type of questions they're going to see. And then mapping out that testing plan 2 or 3 times at most for the SSAT. And again, on the ISEE, you can only take it twice. And then test prep, if you're thinking about, again, there is a lot of content to be covered. There is a lot of strategy as well. Generally, you're looking at about 8 to 12 weeks before that first test, just to give students a little bit more time to get more comfortable with this. And I will say, the one nice thing that I like about SSAT test prep and ISEE test prep is you do get academic bang for your buck, right? It's not just all about beating the test. Certainly there is a strategy component to it, but there's also some good content review. So we'll work with students on, computational math skills. There's no calculator allowed, so fractions, percents, decimals, do some vocab with them, not death by vocab, go over reading strategies and active reading and summarizing. So students do get a lot of carryover into their academic work as well. So here's the score report. This is from the SSAT. So again, you get a baseline score. So you see exactly how your student did in each of the sections. There's an estimated percentile score as well as part of that score report to give you a feel. And then the other nice thing is students will take home the test booklet. In that score report, they also get an itemized score report back that shows every question they answered correctly and every question that they missed. The questions are categorized by difficulty level. So with the test booklet, students can go back and get a feel for the types of questions that they missed. And again, I know I covered a lot tonight. I hope this was helpful, but hopefully it gives you, hopefully in terms of what we covered tonight, a little bit of context in terms of how the tests are used in school admissions. Again, many factors. It's not just going to come down to an ISEE score or an SSAT score. the scoring of the tests, the format of them. Hopefully, you get a better feel in terms of what these tests actually look like, some of the content, some of the types of questions that students are going to see, just a little bit of a demonstration in terms of how these tests are susceptible to strategy and how strategy can be helpful for students, the different options for taking them and the timeline for taking them, and then a little bit of test planning in terms of most students are going to be targeting, kind of sort of November, December, those windows, early January is needed for taking these tests. And again, I know I covered a lot tonight, but really these are just tests. They are not the be all end all, of the secondary school admission process. Many, many different factors are going to go in. And when we talk about mapping out or customizing a test prep plan for students, obviously it's going to be age appropriate. But we also want them to get some academic bang for their buck out of a tutoring program. And most importantly, it's giving them a game plan, building up their confidence, just so they can go in there and kind of show off a little bit. I want students when they take it for real to be excited about that. Just, they know what to expect on it. They can kind of put their best foot forward there. Again, if you're not familiar with us, I'm Drew from Summit. Definitely take advantage of our free practice tests. Over the summer, we'll start offering both SSAT and ISEE tests out of both our Waltham, Massachusetts office and New Canaan, Connecticut office. But if coming in is not convenient, students can absolutely do it at home, either paper and pencil or online. And then as you get into this, if you're looking for a little bit more customized support, we do one-on-one tutoring. So we'll map out a testing plan for you. And we do academic tutoring as well. All right. Let's see. I'm not sure if any questions came in, but if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A box. And just as I'm bringing up the questions, just potentially want to launch this poll here. Obviously, you can reach out to us at any time, but if you would like a program director to reach out to you directly to kind of schedule that diagnostic test or to walk you through our tutoring program, definitely feel free to fill this out, and I will make sure that one of our program directors follows up with you. Again, you can reach out to us, of course, at any time as well. All right, let me just check the Q&A box. I'll leave the poll up just to give you time if you would like to. Let's see. Not seeing any questions, which again is totally fine. I know I hit you with a lot. We have recorded this. We'll try to get the link to the recording out to you tomorrow or on Thursday, because again, I know I covered a lot of ground tonight, so that way you can go back, rewatch, or re-listen to any of this. And if you have friends or colleagues who you think might be interested in it, in this presentation, definitely feel free to forward the link to the recording onto them as well. All righty. Let's see. My goal was around 8. It's about 8:05, so we'll kind of call that a win. But so appreciate everyone joining tonight. I hope this information was helpful for you. And again, please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you need anything. All right. Thanks, everybody. So appreciate your taking the time, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening. All right. Take care, everybody.